Welcome to the program. The United Nations is accusing the Myanmar military authorities of using executions to kill their way out of a crisis of their own creation. State media said 2 men, both well-known pro-democracy figures, were put to death along with 2 others. Chow Min-yu, here on the left, who was also known as Ko Jimmy, was a long-time political activist. Pyozea Dao was a hip-hop artist who'd been working as an elected lawmaker before the coup which overthrew the elected government last year. The UN says that Myanmar's military has killed more than 2,000 people since it seized power, and 30% of them have died in custody. Well, Pyozea Dao's mother has given this interview to the BBC.
I want to arrange a funeral plan according to traditional customs. I have to know what day and how the execution was carried out. I asked the prison authorities to return his body or his ashes, but they only said the execution was carried out over the weekend. Although family members refused to return until the bodies were recovered, we were forced to return as the prison authorities did not respond. When we met on Zoom last Friday, my son was healthy and smiling. He asked me to send his reading glasses, dictionary and some money to use in the prison. So I collected those things and brought them to the prison today, and that's why I didn't think they would kill him. What I wanted to say for him was that I didn't know in advance that he would be executed. I am proud of my son. He even gave his life. If possible, I want to take his bones and ashes and place them at a martyr's temple.
Let's also bring you the reaction from Human Rights Watch.
This is clearly a signal to the Myanmar people from the junta that they are prepared to do whatever it takes, whatever rights abuses, whatever atrocities, whatever crimes they think they need to do in order to try to control the situation. They are now moving to execute political prisoners. That is the message today, that we will stop at nothing. It is a sign of the depravity of the Myanmar junta that they are prepared to take this kind of step.
Well, we're joined now by Ong Chow Mo, advisor to the Minister of Human Rights of the Myanmar Government of National Unity. He's currently in exile in an undisclosed location. Thank you very much for talking to us. Can I just start by getting your reaction to this news?
Thank you for having me. It's indeed very sad and very shocking news what had happened. And this clearly indicates that the junta they have announced that they will do whatever they need to do or they are capable of doing. And this includes very serious gross human rights violations. And a lot of people are saying this is like executions of death sentence. And this is the first time in 30 years that 4 people at one time are being executed, and we can call it like murder in prison rather than death sentence executions, because the family member did not have access to lawyer, and it was carried out in a way that's fall against the existing law. So this is very much inhuman. It is part of the ongoing crimes against humanity that Burmese military has been committing against its own civilian. And this is very same military who committed genocides against Rohingya people and carried out war crimes against the ethnic people.
Can I just ask whether you personally knew any of the activists who've been executed?
I personally did not knew them, but I have heard about them, and I have like connections, indirect connections with them.
So we were hearing there from the mother of Pyozea Dao about just how little access to information they had. They did not know that this was going to happen as late as a day before. What more can you tell us about the manner in which these executions were carried out?
It was done in a very, very, very dirty way and very, very inhuman way, as I mentioned earlier, because the family should have had, in any circumstance, the family should have had access to each of their family members and should be aware of what is going to happen to their family members. Even after being murdered, the dead body was not returned and the right information was not given to the family members, what had happened to their family members. And so there was very little to no information indeed, despite an announcement that being made on the national, on the junta-controlled newspaper.
And why do you think that the military junta has decided to resort to measures like this, to capital punishment?
The thing is, they are trying to see whether they can stop, they can show that the level of the brutality to the people, and then kind of stop the revolutions. And indeed, the more they try to do this kind of human right violations, gross human right violations, and inhuman crimes they commit, the more people will be accelerating to defend themselves and to prevent them controlling the country. So it is indeed very wrong way what they are doing. It's very, very a shame. They should be ashamed, because international community, including ASEAN member state, has been claiming repeatedly that not to kill or murder the political prisoners are being, because earlier there was signal that they would be executed after announcing that they are given the death sentence.
I mean, you're clearly quite angry about what's happened, but what are you able to do about it? You're a member of the National Unity Government, you're currently exiled. What can you actually do to get a message sent to the military junta?
I mean, the National Unity Government had made clearly announcement to the whole populations in the country to defend themselves, and of course we have been, in order to defend ourselves and in order to provide the protections to each of the citizens of the country, each of the civilians. The government leaders has made the announcement to self-defend, and the government has already established people defense force and things like that. So the only way to make this junta understand is to speak on their own language. I'm not inciting violence here. However, million of people in Burma have tried to peacefully protest. In return, what the people got is like bullets while peacefully protesting. So this is a military which has a very bad history track record of killing, murdering, and raping women, and while the civilian itself will peacefully claim things, and the response would be like very brutal crackdowns and things like that. So the people indeed is very, very angry. The 50 people, like 50 million people versus a few 100,000 people who has gone, is critically the situation. So I am sure there is not yet public announcement being made by the National Unity Government. I am sure there will be very strategic and operational response by the government.
So what about the international response? Do you think that carries much weight when it comes to putting pressure on the military junta? And how would you like the international community to respond to these executions?
I think the international community have enough evidence and enough in order to do what's need to be done to control these things and to ensure that the impunity, the cycle of impunity of such crimes is ending, and the international community must cut all ties with the junta and ensure that they are.
When you say cut all ties, to what extent do you mean? Could you just describe what you mean by that?
Mean that any relationship, these are the guys, the junta leaders are the guys who has very fresh blood, as I mentioned, from genocides and from crimes against humanity, all sorts of international crimes they have been continuously committing against its own people. And international community still, like various countries around the world, are indirectly or directly engaging with the junta in it diplomatically or in economically, and in, of course, a country cannot stand alone. They have territorial control for the moment compared to our government, like the government of the people that has the legitimacy due to the fact that they have control over the military equipment and military personnel of the country. So indeed, in order to but what they couldn't control is the people's mindsets and people mentality to rule those people, and they couldn't fully act as a government, and they will never be, and the people of Burma will not let. So international community must support the people of Myanmar in order to put the country to the path of democracy and to ensure this country has truly principle on the principle of democracy, federal democracy, where it is. It's treat everyone in the country fairly, and if the international community cannot support the Burmese people, later on there would be not much to do for international community to bring back the country to the path of democracy.
All right, Ong Chow Mo, advisor to the Minister of Human Rights of the National Unity Government. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
We've seen bravery and honor in these hearings, and Ms. Matthews and Mr. Pottinger, both of you will be remembered for that, as will Cassidy Hutchinson. She knew all along that she would be attacked by President Trump and by the 50, 60, and 70-year-old men who hide themselves behind executive privilege. She has courage, and she did it anyway.
And I'm back with Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney, the vice chair of the January 6th committee. Congresswoman, we just heard you making a point at the last hearing, commending the bravery of the female witnesses who testified. You called them inspirations to American girls and women, suggested that they're braver than a lot of middle-aged men. What middle-aged men are you specifically talking about, and why do you think these young women are so much braver?
Well, I think it has been tremendously moving and inspirational, not just for me, but for women, especially all across this country, men too, to see just the awesome courage of someone like Cassidy Hutchinson, like Sarah Matthews, like Shay Moss and Ruby Freeman and Caroline Edwards. These women who have come in front of the committee, Cassidy Hutchinson alone at that table, swearing an oath and telling the truth, which is in such contrast, for example, to her boss, Mark Meadows. And the extent to which not just the people that you've seen, but others that you haven't seen, people who understand, and they do tend to be younger, often they tend to be women, who understand that what happened can never happen again, and who've been willing to step forward and tell the truth and do their patriotic duty. And it is a tremendous lesson for all of us. I have daughters who are the ages of some of these young women who have come in front of the committee, and I hope my daughters would never be in the position that they've been in, but I also hope that they would conduct themselves with the kind of honor and patriotism and courage we've seen from people like Cassidy Hutchinson and Sarah Matthews and others.
During Thursday's hearing, the House Republican Conference Twitter account attacked Sarah Matthews as a liar and a pawn for Pelosi. They never said one word about the other witness right next to her, Matthew Pottinger. Why do you think the Trump MAGA forces are focusing their attacks more on the women testifying, like Matthews, like Cassidy Hutchinson?
Well, it certainly is the case that the attacks against some of the women witnesses have been particularly vicious. I also think that the response that we've seen from the House Republicans is really disgraceful. And the fact that we've gotten to a point where we had an attack on the Capitol, we had a president who sent a mob he knew was armed to try to stop the counting of electoral votes, and who refused to tell the mob to go home for hours. And the response to that by my fellow Republicans in the House is to try to embrace Trump talking points and attack the people who want the country to understand what happened, I think is really disgraceful. And I think, look, our country is at a moment where we really have to, all of us, take a big step back and all of us say, look, the normal sort of vitriolic, toxic partisanship has got to stop. And we have to recognize what's at stake. And individuals like those who are running the Republican conference, who are the leadership of the Republicans in the House, need to be held accountable for their actions. And they need to understand how serious the situation is.
Trump and a bunch of those House Republican leaders are trying to get you defeated in your primary, your Republican primary in August. I couldn't help but notice that two of the individuals whom we've heard from in these hearings privately expressing outrage at their former boss's lies and actions, former Trump campaign manager Bill Stepien and former Trump campaign spokesman Tim Murtaugh. They're both currently fully engaged in trying to defeat you in the Wyoming primary, specifically because you're standing up to the very things that they expressed outrage about privately. That must be really strange for you.
I mean, look, it's a highly unusual moment, certainly in American politics. And I am working hard here in Wyoming to earn every vote. But I will also say this, I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to say things that aren't true about the election. My opponents are doing that, certainly simply for the purpose of getting elected. And Jake, if I have to choose between maintaining a seat in the House of Representatives or protecting the constitutional republic and ensuring the American people know the truth about Donald Trump, I'm going to choose the Constitution and the truth every single day. And so, as I said, I'm fighting hard. No matter what happens on August 16th, I'm going to wake up on August 17th and continue to fight hard to ensure Donald Trump is never anywhere close to the Oval Office ever again.
If you end up losing your job in Congress because of your work on this committee, it will have been worth it to you?
There's no question. I believe that my work on this committee is the single most important thing I've ever done professionally. It is an unbelievable honor to represent the people of Wyoming in Congress. And I know that all of us who are elected officials take an oath that we swear under God to the Constitution. And that oath has to mean something. And that oath means that we cannot embrace and enable a president as dangerous as Donald Trump is. And my obligations and my responsibilities on this committee are to ensure that we understand exactly what happened so that we can establish legislation and recommendations to help ensure it never happens again.
You've made it very clear you don't think Donald Trump should ever be trusted with the presidency again. Are you willing to run for president to try to stop him, at least in part?
I haven't really, at this point, I have not made a decision about 2024. And I am really very focused on the substance of what we have to do on the Select Committee, very focused on the work that I have to do to represent the people of Wyoming. And I'll make a decision about 2024 down the road. But I do think as we look towards the next presidential election, as I said, I believe that our nation stands on the edge of an abyss. And I do believe that we all have to really think very seriously about the dangers we face and the threats we face. And we have to elect serious candidates. And we've got to elect people who will take their obligations and their oaths seriously and who will deal with issues of substance with respect for people who have disagreements. And we've got to be able to come together and stop the very dangerous kind of politics that we have lived through over the last year and a half, certainly.
One question about a vote that you cast. You were one of 47 House Republicans who voted this week to codify same-sex marriage protections. It's a culmination of a remarkable personal evolution for you. You used to oppose same-sex marriage that infamously led to a public falling out with your own sister. What's your message to any Senate Republican who's on the fence about voting for this bill?
Freedom means freedom for everybody. And I've said that my initial opposition 10 years ago to same-sex marriage was wrong. I love my sister very much and her family very much. And I believe that that given the decision that we saw from the Supreme Court and the suggestion that the additional rulings could be at risk, that the suggestion in Justice Thomas's opinion about that means that we have got to step up and make sure that we're providing protections. And so certainly ensuring that we've provided that kind of protection for same-sex marriage is very important. And so I would urge my Republican colleagues in the Senate to follow suit and to do the same.
Congresswoman Liz Cheney, Republican of Wyoming, joining us today from Wyoming. Thank you so much for your time today.
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson. Tonight, happy Monday, trying to stay cheerful in the face of everything that's happening to the country. We talk about it every night, multiple disasters all at once. But if you had to isolate one single tragedy that's produced the highest casualty rate in the United States, it would probably have to be the opioid crisis. Over the past 25 years, opioids have destroyed entire regions of the country, mostly rural areas, places populated by the people who built and fed this country for generations. Hundreds of thousands of them have died from opioids, and they're still dying. More than 100,000 drug ODs just last year, mostly from fentanyl. Fentanyl's imported from China, it's smuggled through Mexico. If you live here, you probably know someone who's died from fentanyl, probably someone's child. What you may have forgotten in the face of all this sadness is that the opioid epidemic was not organic. It didn't just happen one day because people in sparsely populated zip codes in Kentucky and Vermont and West Virginia suddenly felt sad and started taking dangerous drugs. No. This particular disaster was created by drug companies. That's true. Purdue Pharma kicked it off. They did so by aggressively marketing a narcotic called OxyContin. They sold it to doctors, and doctors sold it to their patients on the false claim it was non-addictive. It was very addictive. What happened next? Well, drive through upstate New York sometime. You can see the human carnage. Ultimately, Purdue Pharma faced a barrage of lawsuits and then criminal charges. In the end, however, not a single executive from that or any other drug company ever went to jail. So no one was ever really punished for all those deaths, hundreds of thousands of deaths. Well, for a brief moment, it seemed possible that somebody would be punished. No one remembers this, but during the Democratic primaries in 2019, Kamala Harris, of all people, described pharma executives as, quote, nothing more than some high-level dope dealers who should, quote, be held accountable. Then a few months later, she went further than that. Harris suggested the drug companies were so evil they might produce a COVID vaccine that wound up hurting people. Quote, if Donald Trump tells us we should take it, I'm not taking it, Harris said. And then other Democrats, including Andrew Cuomo, then the governor of New York, said the very same thing. But here's the amazing part. The second Joe Biden took office, talk like that stopped immediately. Never has a tune changed faster. Kamala Harris, who just months before had called drug companies dope dealers, suddenly sounded like the chief marketing officer at Pfizer. At one point, Harris announced that volunteers would go, quote, door to door to promote Pfizer's products. Never in our history have federal officials touted a publicly held company more aggressively than the Biden administration touted Pfizer. And as a result, Pfizer's stock price exploded. Its executives made billions. Gone was any suggestion that the drug companies might be capable of doing anything wrong ever. Instead, the media and the Biden administration lauded pharma executives as moral heroes. And some of their products are life-saving, that is true. But the bigger truth we are now learning is more complicated than that. In just the past few weeks, serious, very serious questions have emerged about some of the most widely prescribed drugs in America, very much including the COVID vaccines. But we want to begin tonight with what in any normal period would be front-page news around the world. It turns out the entire premise behind the most commonly prescribed antidepressant drugs appears to be completely wrong. These drugs are known as SSRIs. They're ubiquitous. Between 1991 and 2018, total SSRI prescriptions in the US rose by more than 3,000%. The number of prescriptions for the most common SSRIs hit 224 million last year. 224 million prescriptions in a country of 3 million people. In other words, you know dozens of people who are taking SSRIs. You may be taking them right now. And yet for decades, there have been strong indications that there is a problem with these drugs. And the most obvious is this. Antidepressants are supposed to cure depression. That's why they're prescribed. And yet over the same period that SSRI prescriptions have risen 3,000%, the suicide rate, maybe the most reliable indicator of all of depression, has not fallen in the United States. In fact, the suicide rate has jumped by 35%. That's a huge increase. That's a lot of dead people. Now, drug makers admit that their products may be part of the reason for the increase in suicide. The makers of Prozac, for example, concede that young people who take that drug have an increased risk of suicide compared to those who took a placebo. Think about that for a second. A drug that's supposed to make you less sad may make it more likely that you will kill yourself. How is that allowed? Well, it's been allowed because virtually no one has said a word about it. One person who did say something about it a long time ago was the actor Tom Cruise. All the way back in 2005, he had a very famous appearance on the Today Show. You may remember it. Here it is.
Here we are today, where I talk out against drugs and psychiatric abuses of electric shocking people, okay, against their will, of drugging children with them not knowing the effects of these drugs. Do you know what Adderall is? Do you know Ritalin? Do you know now that Ritalin is a street drug? Do you understand that? Aren't there examples, and might not Brooke Shields be an example of someone who benefited from one of those drugs? All it does is mask the problem, Matt. And if you understand the history of it, it masks the problem. That's what it does. That's all it does. You're not getting to the reason why. There is no such thing as a chemical imbalance. Drugs aren't the answer. That these drugs are very dangerous. They're mind-altering, antipsychotic drugs. And there are ways of doing it without that so that we don't end up in a brave new world.
So Cruz said a few things. One, maybe you shouldn't trust the pharma companies and just hand your children whatever they're producing and hope for the best. Two, there's no such thing as a chemical imbalance in your brain that causes depression. He said that. And three, these drugs mask the real problems. You're suffering for a real reason that drugs can't fix. Provocative statements. How did the country respond to this? Well, everyone in the media agreed, Tom Cruise is crazy. He's in a cult. Shut up. A lot of people thought that. We may even have thought that. But then more information kept coming out that made Tom Cruise look a little less crazy. In 2015, researchers from the scientific journal BMJ found that, quote, some birth defects occur 2 to 3.5 times more frequently, a lot more frequently, among the infants of women treated with SSRIs early in pregnancy. Wow, that's a huge problem. Ignored. In the same journal in 2020, researchers found that, quote, post-SSRI sexual dysfunction is underrecognized and can be debilitating both psychologically and physically. Well, that's kind of a problem too. If it steals your sex drive, maybe it's stealing your soul? No, ignore it. Only cult members care. Then last year, researchers in Sweden found that, quote, there may be an increased hazard of violent crime during SSRI medication in a small group of patients. It may exist across age groups and throughout treatment periods, and it possibly persists for up to 12 weeks after treatment discontinuation. So even after you stop taking the drugs, you may be impotent, infertile, violent. But at least the drugs cure the chemical imbalance in your brain that causes your depression. That was the selling point. What a great piece of marketing that was. You got a chemical imbalance in your brain. You need these drugs. And so hundreds of millions of prescriptions every year for these drugs. Well, in what seemed like news to us, last week we learned that actually SSRIs don't cure a chemical imbalance in your brain. So the acronym SSRI stands for Selective Serotonin Reuptake Inhibitor. The theory has been for 30 years, that depressed people have an imbalance of serotonin in their brains. They have a chemical imbalance. If you give them more serotonin, then they become less depressed and happy. They're less likely to kill themselves, right? But it turns out that serotonin deficiencies are not the reason people get depressed. That's not just a guess, it's now officially science. This new finding comes from University College London. It just completed a long and huge study on the relationship between depression and serotonin. It was published in the journal Molecular Psychiatry. Here's what the lead author of that study, Joanna Moncrief, said about the findings. Quote, I think we can safely say, after a vast amount of research conducted over several decades, there is no convincing evidence that depression is caused by serotonin abnormalities, particularly by lower levels or reduced activity of serotonin. What? That was the whole premise of the drug which virtually the entire American population was taking on their doctor's advice. And by the way, the drug companies made billions off those drugs. So first we were told that SSRIs would save lives. Now we learn they don't actually work as intended. In fact, the whole idea behind the drug was completely wrong. And yet, and here's the best part, people are ignoring this news and the drugs are still being prescribed. How can that happen in a country based on science? Well, as it turns out, and this is the real point, that happens all the time. On this channel just the other day, Tony Fauci, no less than Tony Fauci, admitted in public that actually we have no idea what effect the COVID vaccines might have on women's fertility, on their menstrual cycles. Wait a second. Remember when suggesting that could get you bounced off of Twitter and Facebook as a conspiracy theorist? Well, it turns out it's true. Here's Tony Fauci.
There's been a number of studies. New York Times just did one about menstruating cycles and how that is affected by vaccines.
Yeah, well, the menstrual thing is something that seems to be quite transient and temporary. That's the point. That's one of the points. We need to study it more.
Oh, we need to study it more. We need to study it more. It's just like human fertility, reproducing the species, the most important event in most people's lives. We need to study it more. Oh, but it's too late. We just forced millions of women to take that drug. Sorry. So how did they release a vaccine and then make it mandatory when they didn't understand the long-term effects of the drug? That's a very good question. Here's Deborah Birx. She's the former White House COVID response director, again on Fox News.
I knew these vaccines were not going to protect against infection, and I think we overplayed the vaccines, and it made people then worry that it's not going to protect against severe disease and hospitalization. It will, but let's be very clear. 50% of the people who died from the Omicron surge were older, vaccinated.
What? Stop the quote. I knew these vaccines were not going to protect against infection. Really, Deborah Birx? But somehow you forgot to mention that as people were being fired from their jobs for not taking this on the premise that if they took it, they would never be infected? When do you get criminally charged? Soon, we hope. And then there's the effect of the COVID vaccines on the elderly, the population most at risk. According to The Lancet, no less than, vaccinated people around Joe Biden's age are 80% more likely to become sick after taking the COVID shot as compared to unvaccinated people. Wait, what? 80% more likely to become sick after taking the shot that was supposed to prevent them from getting sick? How is this not the banner headline? It's being ignored. Well, as one scientist wrote in the Journal of Virology, quote, the study showed that immune function among vaccinated individuals 8 months after the administration of 2 doses of the COVID-19 vaccine was lower than that among the unvaccinated individuals. So it's not just that your natural antibodies were more powerful than the vaccine. We've known that for a long time, though they lied about it. Turns out the vaccine appears to depress your immune system. This has massive implications, not just for COVID. There are all kinds of horrible diseases you can get with the suppressed immune system. The Journal of Food and Chemical Toxicology found the same thing. Quote, vaccination induces a profound impairment in type 1 interferon signaling, which has diverse adverse consequences to human health. What the hell? And yet these people are on TV blithely admitting, oh, well, we should do more study on that, after we forced it on the entire American population, on billions of people globally. And this might explain how Joe Biden got COVID after getting every available shot and telling us just a year ago that vaccines conferred total immunity.
The various shots that people are getting now cover that. You're okay. You're not going to get COVID if you have these vaccinations.
Hey folks, guess you heard this morning I tested positive for COVID, but I've been double vaccinated, double boosted.
So one of the response to this is great sadness, of course, because even people who didn't vote for Joe Biden believed his administration when they said this, because they were acting in the name of science. People were afraid of COVID, in some cases with great justification. Some people were at risk of dying from COVID. And they reached out and accepted this drug on the promise, told to them repeatedly that it would save them. And now Deborah Birx says, well, I knew it didn't really work. So the question is, why is no one being held accountable? Why is the party that promised to hold Big Pharma accountable ignoring this? They're not saying a single word about any of these lies from the pharmaceutical industry, which is making billions. And there's more. There's more. It turns out that Alzheimer's drugs, the most widely prescribed Alzheimer's drugs, don't actually treat Alzheimer's. You know, it does Viagra, That appears to work because in 2022, nothing's too weird to be true. But that's not what they're prescribing. In 2014, in the journal Alzheimer's and Dementia, researcher Jeffrey Cummings found a 99% failure rate of Alzheimer's treatments in the pipeline for production. But he suggested that further treatments would be more successful. Well, how does that work? Because the new medications, Cummings wrote, would effectively target the proteins that form so-called sticky plaques in the brains of people who suffer from Alzheimer's. Just like a lack of serotonin was thought to cause depression, sticky plaques in the brain were thought to cause Alzheimer's. If you're interested in the subject, you've definitely read that. So these new drugs came out. They're very expensive. Did they work? No, they failed. 2 new Alzheimer's drugs, one from the drug company Genentech, the huge biotech firm Genentech, the other from Biogen, were supposed to target sticky plaques, and they did. But here's what they didn't do. Fix Alzheimer's. They did nothing to affect Alzheimer's. Incidentally, the FDA approved Biogen's drug despite a 10-0 vote from the FDA's own advisory committee to reject it. What? So it turns out that the assumption about sticky plaque causing Alzheimer's is likely wrong. And the people running our public health establishment knew it was wrong, but ignored the fact it was wrong. And again, no one's being held accountable. The entire population trusts the science. If you want to make people distrust the science and go to the witch doctor rather than the pediatrician to treat their kid's flu, this is how you act. You lie, and then you never admit it, apologize, or hold the liars accountable. So the claim that sticky plaques caused Alzheimer's originated in a 2006 paper in the journal Nature, and it was written by neuroscience professor Sylvain Lesne. Recently, a Vanderbilt University neuroscientist called Matthew Schrag took a closer look at that 2006 paper. So did Science Magazine. What did they find? We're quoting, shockingly blatant fraudulent data, according to Donna Wilcock, who works on Alzheimer's at the University of Kentucky. Elizabeth Bick, a molecular biologist, reported that, quote, data might have been changed to fit a better hypothesis. Holy smokes. So how did the NIH, which is working with your money on your behalf to keep the nation healthy, how did they respond to this? Well, they awarded that same scientist a new grant to study Alzheimer's. And the Democratic Party, Pharma's new best friends, haven't said a word about it. Instead, they're finding new ways to send your cash to their donors. Here's a new trans admiral.
So we really want to base our treatment and to affirm and to support and empower these youth, not to limit their participation in activities and sports, and even limit their ability to get gender affirmation treatment in their state.
So whatever you think of the trans question, kids struggling with questions about gender identity, notice the first thing that person says, the salient point that person makes, is that a drug can fix it. Really, more drugs. So the same people who had no clue what SSRIs did and then pushed them for decades, the same people who are making toddlers take the COVID shot despite the obvious risks and no data whatsoever to support giving it to toddlers, the same people who fast-tracked useless Alzheimer's drugs to the elderly are now telling you that kids with gender identity disorders must have more drugs. And the administration that promised to hold Big Pharma accountable cheers them on. Maybe at this point we should acknowledge that drugs are not the answer to every human problem. People are more than just a collection of chemicals that can be manipulated to produce a desired result. They're human beings. They have souls. If they're sad or sick or alienated from other people, it's just possible that Pfizer is not the solution. Now, Johan Hari has been saying this exact thing for a long time, shouting into the darkness, being ignored, having his books attacked in reviews. He's written a whole book about this exact subject called Lost Connections, uncovering the real causes of depression and the unexpected solutions. We talked about this before, and we couldn't resist inviting him back on the eve of his vindication. Johan Hari, thanks so much for coming on. You've been saying for like a decade now that drugs are not the answer to depression. How do you greet this news that you were right?
Look, drugs can give some relief to some people. They gave relief to me for a while, but we've got to be really honest with people. Everyone watching knows they have natural physical needs, right? You need food, you need water, you need clean air. If I took those things away from you, you'd be in real trouble real fast. But there's equally strong evidence that everyone has natural psychological needs. You need to feel you belong. You need to feel your life has meaning and purpose. You need to feel that people see you and value you. And this culture we built is good at lots of things, but we've been getting less and less good at meeting people's deep underlying psychological needs. And that is the reason why depression has been hugely rising. And the issue I have is not so much with the drugs. The drugs give some relief. They cause some severe side effects for some people. Over time, for most people, but not everyone, the effects tend to wear off. But my issue isn't so much with the drugs. My issue is with the story we tell that accompanies the drugs, right? We're giving people an inaccurate map of their pain. When I went to my doctor and I was really depressed and I was a teenager, I was told, oh, your pain is just a function in your brain, right? You're lacking serotonin. All you need to do is drug yourself. And for me personally, what I needed to figure out was, I had been severely abused when I was a child. I had a lot of work to do on processing that, on realizing that I didn't deserve to be treated that way. Actually, it was only once I did that I found my way out of depression, right? And so my issue is, because I was told to distrust my brain, I was told to, everyone watching, your pain makes sense. Your depression and anxiety are not malfunctions. They are signals. They're telling us something. Now, not everyone was abused. Some people, there is scientific evidence for 9 causes of depression and anxiety that I write about in my book, Lost Connections. And 2 of them are in our biology, although none of them are a chemical imbalance. But most of them are factors in the way we live. Think about loneliness, right? Depression and anxiety doubled in the last 2 years as we all became much lonelier. Now, that's completely common sense. Your grandma would have understood that immediately. Gee, grandma, do you think if you're really lonely, you're more likely to be depressed and anxious? We've got to return to more common sense understandings of depression and anxiety, most importantly because they lead us to the real solutions. For example, here in Britain, there was a huge program of encouraging depressed and anxious people when they came to the doctor to first try taking part in gardening programs. Turned out to be twice as effective as giving people drugs because it was dealing with their loneliness. When we understand what's really causing depression and anxiety, we can get to the real solutions. And that's what's so important. Your pain makes sense. We need to stop insulting that pain and start listening to it because it's telling us something we really need to hear.
I agree completely. Noah Hari, thank you so much. Great to see you tonight.
Cheers, Tucker. Thanks.
I mean, the central fact of human life is that it ends. And a secular society that has no answer for what happens after death is absolutely certain to make everyone crazy and neurotic. So everyone's crazy and neurotic. Well, the Biden administration is trying to downplay the fact that we're heading into a recession, and they're downplaying it by just changing the definition of the term. Kind of amusing, kind of scary. Consecutive quarters of declining real GDP. In the first quarter of this year, GDP went down. This week, second quarter GDP numbers will be released. What will they tell us? Well, here's a hint. The White House just released a statement, quote, while some maintain that 2 consecutive quarters of falling GDP constitute a recession, that is neither the official definition nor the way economists evaluate the state of the business cycle. Really? Okay. Well, we thought we would talk to someone who has seen a lot of business cycles. Been in business. Vivek Ramaswamy is executive chairman and co-founder of Strive Asset Management, which is a fascinating new company. He joins us tonight. Vivek, thanks so much for coming on. So you're in business. What do you think of this new definition of a recession?
Look, it's like George Orwell who said it best, right? The best way to control a society is to control its language first. That's right. And just like diversity is conformity, inclusion is exclusion, war is peace, now apparently a recession is something other than 2 consecutive quarters of GDP decline. Now, the thing I'll tell you, Tucker, is most sophisticated investors in the market have already quietly accepted the fact that we are in a recession, regardless of what this administration says. Investors pay attention to companies' earnings. Just look at Walmart's disastrous report earlier today where they slashed their profit expectations for the future. So investors aren't really going to pay attention to what the administration says. They know what's really going on. But the thing to pay attention to here is that it's not just the recession that matters. We are also facing rampant 9+% inflation. And in the market, you can either have recession without inflation. You could, in principle, have 9+% inflation without a recession. It's a double whammy for us right now. We're facing both. And meanwhile, the people in charge of this administration are focusing on changing the language. That tells you a bit about where their priorities are.
So the Walmart statement suggested, they said recession's the reason that their earnings will be short. But they suggested that maybe real recession is higher than 9%. What do you think that the actual experienced number is for people?
Well, I think if you look at who the everyday customer is at Walmart relative to a range of other businesses that may be more insulated by other forms of government subsidy or protection, this is where the everyday American shops, right? So I think that you have to look as a sophisticated market observer, you got to look at where the real harbingers are and where the real proxies are for the experience of the everyday American. And I think that the real experience of inflation combined with inflation that's driven by actually high energy prices in this country suggests that actually the experience of most Americans is even worse than the numbers suggest. But this administration's just fixated on these band-aid solutions, like focusing on the language we use to describe it rather than addressing the problem.
Of course. Vivek Ramaswamy, a man who is addressing problem. We will see you again. Appreciate your coming on tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we've sent many billions of dollars to Ukraine because their border security is so important, unlike ours. But now the government of Ukraine is trying to impose censorship. Why are we doing this exactly? Well, as Joe Biden has told us repeatedly, doing his Winston Churchill imitation, we're doing it to protect democracy. But of course, the irony here is Ukraine is not a democracy in any recognizable sense. The Ukrainian government has banned media outlets that are hostile to it. They've also shut down opposition parties. They arrested the main opposition leader. That's a democracy? So because we allowed that to happen, in fact, we funded it all, now the Ukrainian government has decided that they can impose censorship in our country. The Ukrainian government has issued a blacklist of so-called Russian propagandists, Americans. That list includes Rand Paul, Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, Tulsi Gabbard, who's serving in the U.S. military, and Glenn Greenwald, among many others. So we thought we'd speak to a couple of them. Starting off tonight, Glenn Greenwald. He's an independent journalist. He works on Substack, among other places. Glenn, thanks so much for coming on. So you're being blacklisted by the Ukrainian government, which is a beacon of democracy. Tell us how this works.
Yeah, I mean, I thought President Zelensky had a war to run. Apparently, he has a lot of time to watch the Morning Joe show. They sit around for hours accusing everybody they want to discredit of being a Kremlin agent and teaching American liberals how to do the same. You know, it's easy to mock, but it's actually quite outrageous, Tucker. The Ukrainians have a conflict with this neighboring country in Russia. They're totally free to pursue whatever war policies they want. They can fight Russia for the next 10 years if they choose, but that's not what they're doing. They're begging and, in a sense, demanding that other countries, including my own, the United States, provide them with a seemingly endless supply of weapons and money, which means we not only have the right but the obligation to debate that and ask whether that's in the interest of the American people to do. And so for Zelensky to essentially try and export the repression he's imposed in his own country here to the United States by shutting down debate and accusing those of us asking questions of being Kremlin agents or Russian propagandists takes incredible gall, while he's also demanding that we turn over all our money and weapons to him at the same time.
This is the guy George W. Bush described as the George Washington of our age. I haven't heard really anybody in Washington say a single word about this.
Yeah, I mean, you know, from the beginning, as you know as well as anybody, Tucker, there was a very concerted effort to eliminate all space to ask any questions. Anyone who asked the question of whether we should do more to prevent the war diplomatically, like Tulsi Gabbard, or whether we should risk our own money and a potential nuclear exchange with Russia over Ukrainian border disputes, got called a Kremlin agent or a Russian asset. And this is the strategy that they're using to try and prevent us in the United States from exercising our freedom to debate what role our government should play in that war.
Exactly. In the name of democracy, they shut it down. Glenn Greenwald, thank you so much for that.
Thanks, Tucker.
So Tulsi Gabbard is also on this blacklist. She's also someone the Ukrainian government says should be censored. She serves the U.S. military. She served in the United States Congress. She ran for president. Now she's joining us, and we're happy that she is. Congressman, thank you so much for coming on. What's your reaction to finding yourself on this blacklist?
I see the hypocrisy, Tucker. The hypocrisy of this blacklist is, and frankly, why the American people should care about this is the Biden-Harris administration and the Washington elite from both parties are continuing to be willing to impoverish the American people and people around the world and push us closer and closer to nuclear war and Holocaust, all to protect democracy and defeat autocracy in Ukraine. And all of this is happening as the Ukrainian president is frankly exposing that there is no democracy. A few examples of some of the things that he's doing: in silencing any dissenting voices, imprisoning political opponents, banning all political activity from the 11 opposition parties, frankly taking control of all national media under his unified information policy, and now he's turning his sights on Americans, not only myself and others you've mentioned, but a sitting U.S. Senator. The danger of this, again, goes to the cost that our leaders are willing to exact as they continue this facade of a push for so-called democracy and defeat autocracy. The whole thing is so hypocritical, and we need to hold our leaders accountable for it.
I couldn't agree more. I have to ask you, since you served in Washington for years, I know you're not generally aligned with Steve Bannon, or at least in the public mind, but you watched him get convicted last week of contempt of Congress for not cooperating with the January 6th committee, while many others, Eric Holder, Lois Lerner, have not been put on trial for ignoring subpoenas from the Congress. What's your reaction to this?
It shows the double standard in Washington, but more dangerously, it shows how this administration is so willingly weaponizing our Department of Justice to act as their own personal political hit squad and going after political opponents and turning a blind eye to people on their own team. This is incredibly dangerous because when you look at what's at the heart of our democracy, it is the rule of law. It is our ability as Americans to be able to trust that these public institutions are serving the public interest and not favoring whoever's in power versus who's not in power. That no matter our political affiliation, how we use our free speech, the color of our skin, how we worship, none of these things should matter, because we should have faith that our justice system will treat us equally and fairly across the board. This weaponization of the Department of Justice is incredibly dangerous and sets a dangerous precedent that undermines this very foundation of our democracy.
You served in the Congress as a Democrat. When the Washington Post started attacking you, I started paying very close attention to what you were saying. Why do they dislike us? Because you're a person of principle, that's why, and I hate that. I appreciate your coming on tonight. Tulsi Gabbard, as always.
Thank you.
So, equitable policing, that's the latest fad. What does that mean exactly? Well,